Hi everyone. So in today's video, I thought to talk about how cancer starts and how it grows and how sometimes it eventually spreads in the body. And I thought about talking it from the cellular level. So I will try to keep this as simple as possible. And if you have any questions, please do leave a comment and I will try my best to explain it. So, when we start to look at this at the cellular level, there are a few things that we have to understand first. So, in every cell, there's this thing called the nucleus. This nucleus is kind of like the control center for how the cell should function. And in this nucleus, there's a script. So, we all know this. It's called the DNA. This DNA is like a string where it is divided into sections. So these sections are called genes. And these genes have the recipe on how to make certain kinds of proteins that are necessary to keep a cell functioning, keep the body functioning. So now we know about DNA, genes, and how genes make proteins. So sometimes when these genes have mistakes in them, we call it a mutation. It can produce faulty proteins. So it won't work as it is supposed to. So this is what eventually leads into a growth of a cancer. So let's look at how this might happen. So there are two types of genes that are involved in this cancer growth. One of them is called proto-oncogenes. So in healthy cells, these proto-oncogenes are the ones who decide how a cell should divide, how it should grow. And this is sort of like the gas pedal of a cell. So you know, when you're driving a car and when you hit the gas pedal, that's when your car goes forward. And that is kind of like the same thing that happens in a cell. But sometimes if there's a mutation in these proto-oncogenes, then it becomes an oncogene. So this is kind of like when you're hitting the gas pedal and it gets stuck in the on position. So that's a very scary thing, right? When you're driving a car and your gas pedal is just like or in the on position all the time, that means you're going forward and forward and forward and there's no stopping. And this is the same thing that happens inside a cell if it's driven by these oncogenes. It will just keep dividing and dividing and dividing. So this is what eventually leads into a cancer. So this is one type of genes that are involved in cancer. The other type is called the tumor suppressor gene. The tumor suppressor gene is kind of like the brakes of a car. So it is what decides when the cell should stop dividing. So a brake would stop the car, right? So if your gas pedal is stuck in the on position, if your tumor suppressor genes are still working, you can hit the brakes and the car will stop, right? So if the tumor suppressor genes are working properly, then your cell can stop dividing. But if these tumor suppressor genes are also mutated, so that means if it's not working properly, that means your cells will not be stopped, will just keep growing and growing. The deactivation of tumor suppressor genes and the activation of oncogenes. So mutation in both of these genes can lead into cancer. So now that we know about the genes that are involved in cancer growth, let's look at what happens inside a cell, what goes wrong so it turns into a cancer cell. Inside every cell, there's like a decision-making process. It has to decide whether it should divide or not. So this is a very complex process, and I will just try to keep it as simple as possible. So there's like a cycle going on. The cell is the beginning of the cell, and at one point it has to decide if it should divide or not. And there's this one important point in those decision making and called the restriction point. It's also called the R point. And when the cell reaches this R point, it has to decide if it's going to divide or not. So when the cell comes and reaches this R point, and if it passes the R point, then the cell will go ahead and divide. So this R point is very important, and it's kind of like a switch, so it's usually off, and when the cell reaches it, and if the switch doesn't turn on, it can't go ahead. So this switch is turned on by releasing some sort of a brake. So remember when I talked about immunosuppressor genes, and it's kind of like a brake. So this is a place where those genes are at work. So these genes, there's a complicated process happening. Basically, if these genes are working properly, the brakes will work properly, and it will only turn on if certain criteria of the cells are met. But if the genes are mutated, that means this brake is no longer working properly. So it will be like the brake is broken and the switch is always on, and the cell will just keep growing and growing and growing. So this means the cell is going to divide uncontrollably. So another very interesting thing that happens in our cells is that even though, when our cell cycle is broken and the switch is broken and everything is just chaotic and everything is just like growing and growing, there are still backup safety systems in place in order to respond to events like this. So one of those things is called apoptosis. So this is very interesting. So what happens is that in apoptosis is that when a cell see that its DNA is damaged or the control center is failed, it can decide to self-destruct for the sake of the rest of the body. So one of the important proteins that are involved in this are called P53. And sometimes in most cancers, these P53 proteins are also mutated, so they aren't working properly. So then this apoptosis cannot happen. So that's why sometimes, cancers overcome this barrier as well. And it can't self-destruct, so the cell will just keep growing and growing. So there's also another line of defense. This is like a built-in counter which keeps track on how many times a cell has divided. So it's a little complicated, so I will try my best to talk about this in very simpler terms. So this is done by something called a chromosome. Think of it like tightly coiled threads of genetic instructions. At the end of these chromosomes, there's this thing called a telomere. So basically, each time a cell divides, these telomeres get shorter and shorter. At one point, when this telomere is too short, when this cap is too short, the cell will automatically stop dividing, because the length of that cap will tell how many times it has divided. And that's another way when a cell just have to stop at one point. So what cancer cells can do is that instead of shortening this cap, it can actually start rebuilding this cap. So instead of shortening every time a cell divides, it will actually rebuild itself. So it will just keep going on and on and on. So at this point, the cancer cells gain the ability to divide endlessly because it has overcome so many barriers. And it not only allows the cancer to grow larger, but it also gives it time to make more mutations and make it even more harmful and a little bit harder to kill, and that makes it more likely to spread into other parts of your body. So it might sound a little scary. I just want to remind you that there's research being done every day, and even like these days there are many therapies and drugs being found to directly target these checkpoints and these faulty genes. One example is this drug they have found to target these cell cycle checkpoint. I'm gonna try my best to say this word correctly. Palbociclib. This drug targets, it's not a chemotherapy drug, so this drug directly targets the cell cycle checkpoint, and it stops cancer cells from growing past the R point in a cell cycle. So this is the switch that we talked about. So there's things happening every day, so research being done every day. These drugs might be at the clinical level, but eventually these will be available at some point. So this is why research and awareness is so important, so you can make an informed decision. So now that we have looked at how cancer grows in one place, you don't die because you have cancer in one place. You die because it grows, and sometimes it invades your body, and it goes to an important organ, and then that organ can't function properly. So how does cancer go from one place to another when other cells don't usually do that? So usually all cells in our body are attached from cell to cell, and also they have these supportive structures around them, protein rich thing that's around them, that is keeping them in place. So this cell to cell adhesion helps the cells to keep them in place, keep them in order. So what happens in cancer is that the molecules that usually keep these cells attached, they stopped working, and the cells usually detach, and that's how cancer cells kind of like break loose. And that's how they eventually start to invade the nearby areas. The important thing is that, like I said, these cells are sometimes attached to cell to cell, and also they are attached to their surrounding by a certain protein. If these cells aren't attached to these surroundings, they self-destruct. They tell their insides to, okay, we are not attached to anything, so we have to die, and they self-destruct. But for the cancer cells, tricks their controls and tells them that even though they are not attached to this outer layer, they say that, oh, we are attached to something, so just go ahead and just stay put. And this is how when eventually they release them from their nearby cells, and even if they are not attached to any surrounding cells, they can survive in other, so they can go into other places and survive there. So even if the cancer cells break away from the primary tumor and manage to enter the bloodstream, it's not easy for them to survive in the bloodstream, because there are white blood cells which are constantly on patrol trying to protect our bodies. So if a white blood cell can identify a cancer, it will eventually kill the cancer. But sometimes cancer cells are smarter, and they can disguise themselves to being like normal cells, and white blood cells won't detect them. And also the cancer cells, even though they go through the bloodstream, sometimes they can't find a proper place to stay. So it has to go in the bloodstream, get attached to another place, and find the proper nutrients, and properly survive there in order to start another colony there. So the journey isn't easy for the cancer cell itself. Eventually, if the cancer cell attached to another organ, it will start another tumor there, and this is called metastasis. Another route is going through the lymphatic system. One I spoke about earlier is going through the bloodstream. The lymphatic system is something kind of like a network of tubes and glands, which help our body to filter fluids and help fight infections. So the cancer cells can enter these tiny lymph nodes, usually nearby where your primary tumor was, and eventually many of these cells will die, but sometimes it can stay there and grow into new tumors. So this is called lymph node spread, and it's kind of another way your metastasis could happen. So when you go for a diagnosis, your primary tumor is examined, and then your lymph nodes are checked to see if they are enlarged or if they are like reactive lymph nodes. It's to check if if there's possibly something there. And sometimes when you know go for treatment, sometimes your lymph nodes are also removed if they suspect there might be cancer there. So this is how metastasis happen. If this was a little bit too complicated, please let me know. I will try to simplify things more. And I will mention one paper. It is a bit old, but I felt like it has properly documented things, and it has the basics covered. But there are more new knowledge coming out every day. So keep yourselves updated. So instead of being scared of cancer, I think the best way forward for all of us is to create awareness around this. So in a future video, I wish to talk about medical imaging, other diagnostic methods to how to detect cancer at early stages. I mean, these things will take time because I am making these videos when I get some free time, because I am a full-time student and I don't have much time to make videos. I hope you keep in touch and keep in touch with this channel. If you do have any questions, please do leave a comment. Yeah, see you. Bye for now.